Hello and welcome to another episode of the AIGA Design Podcast, the official podcast of AIGA, the Professional Association for Design. I'm Lishan Huang, Co-Executive Director of Learning and Programs here at AIGA, and on this season of the show, we have been exploring the intersection of design and performance.
Hello, everyone. I'm Julia Donatello, Design Competitions and Event Manager at AIGA.
And our guest this episode is Kevin Flores. He's a product and design leader, founder, and coach based in San Jose, California. He's worked with a variety of companies, including LinkedIn, 23andMe, and Verizon. And he's also the author of this book that I have here, The Design Career Handbook, Everything You Need to Know to Get a Job and Be Successful. So today we're going to learn more about Kevin, his career journey, and also talk about his new book. All right, Kevin, welcome to the show.
Hi there, everyone. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, it's so great to have you here. So let's just jump into things. Tell us about yourself. This sounds like a job interview, but it's not. Give us a highlights reel of your career journey and creative lineage so far. Your career path has spanned a lot of different things. So yeah, how did you get here today?
Yeah, thank you so much. I have an elevator pitch. I always start with saying that I've done a bit of everything from running an agency to working with early stage startups and in-house at a few big corporations, as you said, like Verizon, 23andMe, and LinkedIn. I studied industrial design and I moved to Silicon Valley after graduating. I was fortunate to start a company with friends early in my career. We had a successful run up until the dot-com crash. And we landed some VC funding and pivoted into software, which was great, although it turned out to be too far removed from creative work. So I started freelancing and consulting. I worked with a number of startups, including one I co-founded and two for a celebrity. And then in startup land, I felt like I was on a repeat loop for a while. And I had that grass is always greener feeling. I saw friends and former colleagues climbing corporate ladders and having more responsibility, leading teams more formally, and obviously working on higher visibility projects. So I went in-house and worked at those few companies. I definitely learned a lot about broad, longer-term strategy and working with teams, big teams, coordinating efforts. But honestly, my responsibility was narrower and everything was much slower than I had experienced before, which of course was expected. So I always advise designers to try out both if they can. It always depends on where they are in their career stage or life stage, or especially, recognizing how they best learn.
Yeah. So on this point and the spectrum, maybe between different kinds of design teams, whether it's like in-house in a large corporate environment or a scrappy startup or agency kind of context, you might have maybe fast, but sometimes a little chaotic in a startup or agency environment, and then maybe slow, but also you learn a lot about managing relationships and stuff like that in a corporate environment. Is there like a sequence? I mean, I think your advice is to try both or figure out where you are, but is there any advice that you give about like where to start or how to figure out that balance as somebody's thinking through their career as a designer?
Sure. I mean, I talk about it with people I mentor all the time, and especially if they're already working and they maybe have a year or two or a couple years behind them. But honestly, it's so personal. So like there's some people that I really, really push and go, you really need to go jump over to startups and just try it out because, they're go-getters. They want to learn faster. They want to really just be in the weeds with lots of different things. And there's other people that, they really need to learn at a little bit more reserved pace, or they need to be surrounded by people at different levels, in which case, working in a large company may be a better fit for them. So it's very, very personal. That's why I mentioned, helping people recognize how they best learn and where they are in their career stage when they might get nudged one way or the other.
Awesome. Very cool. Kevin, you've described that you had a big break as joining the deep dive project for the artist will.i.am, where you initially were hired for a specific task and then ended up having to step up to a leadership role. So for designers early in their career listening to this podcast, what are ways that you suggest and you recommend for them to demonstrate initiative and show more of their work, even if in the beginning of their work is very narrow defined it?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. That particular project was an interesting one. Like what I consider like my mid-career, sort of like a not really a pivot, but just a new direction. But yeah, you hit the nail on the head. I mean, I think today like design is like so segmented now. But even if your role is like narrowly defined, I really advise designers not to voluntarily box themselves in on what they can do or to set limitations on, developing their own skills. I think I was very fortunate that there were just way fewer designers like 10, 15 plus years ago. We were all just designers. We did a little bit of everything. We didn't have so many qualifying prefixes. But today, of course, designers have to focus on what they're responsible for. But what I really, really advise all the time is just to be a strong partner with product managers, engineers, marketers, researchers, basically everybody, and understanding what their responsibilities are and collaborate as much as you can on areas that they lead. That can mean like understanding, better understanding business goals and target metrics, or, when the design is like technically easy or challenging to implement. And of course, like really understanding research insights and which ones might be the most influential. That's literally like, core to what, air quotes here, participating in strategy. I know everyone throws around that phrase so much, but in reality, at its core, it means like contributing to product specs and research and marketing plans and getting into those conversations. So actively giving your thoughts and your opinions and just speaking up and participating. And one other area that I always mention designers, especially if they've been working for a little bit, that they should try to participate in more is prioritizing and sequencing projects, because it's a lot of times it's dictated, but when you start to participate, your voice starts to be heard in these different areas and larger areas of responsibility.
Yeah, you're giving so much great advice right now. I want to dig deeper into your point of view as a leader, as a coach. You've used this term player coach, player dash coach before. And often for a designer, you become, maybe you start out, most of us start out as makers, right? Who are doing things, we're hands-on, we're craftspeople. We might become a leader, maybe a coach, but there is some letting go of that day to day. So, yeah, what are some of these significant shifts and mindsets that designers should think about as they're moving up into management and becoming leaders? And yeah, how do you deal with that identity shift and that task shift?
Sure, sure. First of all, I'm not even a sporty person, and I definitely did not invent the term player coach. But I will say it's funny because we're in a weird place right now, right? I mean, we're seeing job descriptions for design managers where they're really presenting high expectations for hands-on work. So it is sort of having a little bit of a backward slide. And I don't say that in a positive or negative, completely positive or negative way. I certainly don't have a problem with, design leaders being hands-on. But it does represent a bit of a shift for, towards like these back to flatter organizations. And one negative thing that can happen is just reducing that strategic participation and ownership in other areas, kind of like boxing us in, right? But all that being said, it is tough not being as close to the making. But really, if you want to manage, you have to scale yourself and your impact. And the only way you do that is like load balancing your time and your attention elsewhere. And that's in all the obvious places, right? It's in the people management, not just with the, people you may manage directly, but, informing and influencing stakeholders or collaborating closely with cross-functional partners and peers at the same time that you are guiding designers that you do support or manage. Another thing I'll say is that when you get to that management stage, you have to trust your instinct a whole lot more, because you're often at that, that front of the ambiguity where strategies and planning are a lot more fuzzy. And, one other thing I'll say about the whole transitioning to management thing is that although there may be ceilings on responsibility and income, it has been somewhat normalized that you don't have to go in management, as the only route to growth and advancement. You can be a high level designer, like some people are calling it a super senior or super IC, and still have a lot of influence at companies, which I think is great because not everyone is interested in or frankly cut out to manage, and that's perfectly okay.
Yeah. This conversation has me thinking about how we as designers can like reframe and have a more expansive definition of design, because I feel like that sort of sense of, giving up the hands-on stuff and the sort of related identity shift
Hmm.
can be hard to navigate. But I'm reminded of this Eames quote and this definition of design. I think it was Charles, or maybe it was Charles and Ray Eames, who talked about design as a plan for arranging elements in such a way to best accomplish a particular purpose, right? And so that could be elements on a page layout, but elements could also be like the design of your team, right? And like, how do
Right.
you staff people? How do you figure out roles and things like that. So there are different ways of thinking about that, maybe in different canvases or different arenas that designers are working in.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's a whole practice. Although we've seen it expand and now it's contracting again. The whole, area of like design operations, where people, want to be close to design and making, but they also are very interested in organizational design, and that's a cool place to be as well.
Very cool. Yeah. So speaking of some of the advices that you're giving to designers out there, you mentioned that you had a chance earlier in your career to work at Verizon, and you have already shared at some point that a project that you were involved with it's a Gold 90 project, was a product that failed, even though it received a lot of investment. And so, how does this project, how did it teach you about how to, like for projects that didn't go to your portfolio, for instance? So, what are the lessons that it taught you on this type of projects that don't really see the light or have a very short life? And how do you advise the designers to approach this not so successful experiences?
Yeah, yeah. First of all, yeah, Go90 was a huge video platform, consumer video product that not a lot of people saw. But I will say that, I had a great run at Verizon. I was part of an innovation team, air quotes here again. We know what innovation teams has so many connotations. But so our team was loosely associated with that particular project. That being said, the takeaway is really to build upon your knowledge and skills with every single project, because after a while, I know it's very difficult when you're early in career and you've only had a handful of projects, but rapidly by the time you're like getting approaching mid-career and beyond, you're going to have hundreds of projects under your belt, and then they're not all going to be the best projects. They're not always going to be successful, but you just have to learn from every single one and take something positive. Some teams do postmortems and discuss whether a project is successful or not. But it's especially in larger companies, they're often performative, I say, because it lets people vent and be heard. But they really are most valuable when you actually go over a project and document what did go well and what didn't, so that you can leverage that for next time. And even if you don't do that wherever you're working, you should still do that for yourself. And but it's very cliche to say, but often the case that projects that don't do well, they fail for the most obvious reasons. Like, they had faulty business assumptions. Like every startup in history provides the perfect hockey stick growth chart for adoption or revenue. Or, something closer to design is like insights from user research or prototype were ignored. So you just know it's not going to go well. Or the worst case scenario is like no one wanted what was built. I mean, the classic solution looking for a problem scenario. But, as
Yeah,
a designer, you just have to call those out and do your best to steer projects in a direction that have more solid validation or better supported assumptions. And even if those projects, don't turn out great, and don't make it into your portfolio, you still have to you still have opportunity to learn from every project.
awesome. Yeah. Yeah, I really like your approach that we still should keep documented in this reflective process of what we are doing, not necessarily what the company is also doing, like how we are learning as we go.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. Um, so we also want to learn from you what is inspiring you right now? Is there any specific topic or habit that you've engaged with that you want to share with us?
Yeah, I'll share like a left field well, there's another sports analogy, a left field response to this question. I won't say anything about AI, but 2 days ago, we saw the first images of the universe taken by the largest digital camera ever. I don't know if you saw that. And, we've seen now these colorful nebula that are thousands of light years from Earth. And this observatory in Chile is expected to discover like 20 billion new galaxies over the next decade. And even though we can create these, computer generated images like those photos, these are millions of real stars and planets and galaxies out there. So it's kind of awe-inspiring. And Lishan, like a connection to what you said earlier, it reminded me of the short film Powers of 10.
Yeah.
Which everybody can find on YouTube. I definitely recommend it. It was released in 1977.
We'll post it in the show notes. Yeah,
Yes,
great.
for sure. It's so funny because this is the second time this has come up in a matter of weeks. And so it's definitely prompted me to go back and take a look at it. It's this very short film, technically impressive for the time. Starts with a couple people having a picnic in Chicago, then zooms way out to the greater universe, then way back into an atomic scale. But the connection here is that it was written and directed by the design power couple of Charles and Ray Eames. So, I always tell designers that they can find so much inspiration in the work that's come before us. That's another little tiny topic that we touch upon in our book.
Very cool. And related still with the topic of inspiration, we usually ask this in the end of our episodes, but we're trying to make some things here. So what is something, so it could be a book, a movie, an exhibition, a piece of media that you would like to recommend to our listeners besides this, the YouTube
Powers of
video,
10,
The Power of 10? Yeah.
Yeah, so this is such a tough question for me because I'm notorious for recommending books. So we actually have a pretty good book list on our own books website page, and including this one, which I've recently revisited. It's called Orbiting the Giant Hairball by
Okay,
Oh, I
very
hadn't heard
cool.
of that one. Wow.
Oh yeah, it's a lot of fun. It's by a guy named Gordon MacKenzie. He worked at Hallmark Cards for like 30 years, where he had a self-invented job title of Creative Paradox. So I actually got this book years ago at a design leadership event, and I just kind of popped it on my bookshelf. And a few months later, I grabbed it before going on a camping trip, which I didn't know how inspiring it was going to be to consume out in nature, especially because there was no cell coverage. So there was no screens for days, which was great. And I say consume because this is like a piece of art. I mean, the whole book is, it has poetry, it has scribbly drawings, I've got some
Wow.
bookmarks here. It has all kinds of, different kind of types of art and
Hmm.
photography and collages. And that's all surrounding Gordon's, anecdotes about work. And he essentially talks about tapping into the collective creativity and pushing off the stifling forces of corporate environments, which he refers to as the giant hairball. Definitely
Wow.
recommend
Very,
it
All right.
very cool.
I'll have to check
Thanks.
that out as well. Yeah, thank you.
for
And
sure.
again, like all things, we'll post this in the show notes for folks. But let's talk about your book now, Kevin. So lift it up again for folks who are listening to the audio only version. You can check this out on our YouTube channel. But Kevin's book is called Design Career Handbook. So you've positioned it as an, quote, indispensable roadmap to a fulfilling career. You wrote it with your partner and co-author, Janine Flores, to help designers get a job and to be successful. You acknowledge that there's a challenging job market right now. It's a book that came out this year, so you're well aware of the context, and even talked about it as like the worst time to come up with a book of this kind. So can you tell us about your motivation as why you wrote a book like this, certainly at this time in the job market? And yeah, how does this fill gaps or maybe update advice given the difficult job market that designers are facing right now?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, as a quick background, Janine and I worked together for more than half our careers. So, and when I went to lead in-house team, she started teaching design. So we've both been managers and mentors for, all of our careers. And then she added educator to her list. Yeah, we saw an opportunity to compile our best advice, our practical advice from decades of working in all these different environments, as we talked about already. And we think it's a balance. It's balance between reinforcing the advice that designers hear over and over, as well as providing tips that they may not have heard yet. So we definitely have opinions on soft skills and how to do things on the job and how it's a little bit different than school. But it's I think we say this too. We say this all the time. When I talk to people, I'm sure there's actual words in the book that, as much as we say that design has always been a competitive field, yes, it is more challenging now, but it's a worthy and a valuable field as well. So we just encourage people that if they really are interested in being creative in all the ways that that means, it's such a loaded term, but and they really do want to make a difference in the world, and learn lots of different skills. It is a great career to be in. So we still pursue people, or we still tell people to pursue it, like not to be dissuaded by what's going on today.
Yeah, Julia and I gave a talk actually to some high school students in New York City last week. They were doing a summer program up at Columbia University, and they invited AIGA to come talk to them. And one of the things that we talked about is that looking at the statistics alone, this is based on the Bureau of Labor Statistics from
Hmm.
the U.S. federal government, that graphic design, narrowly defined, is in decline, or it's not growing as quickly as a job type compared to even the average of jobs across the country. But what we were trying to paint is like there's a fuller picture. There's other design fields that do not fall under that category. These government categories actually are a little outdated and do not take into account some newer design fields. And then also that, like, even if someone is interested in graphic design, that graphic communication is more needed than ever, right? Especially in this
Hmm.
social media age, and that there's other roles that maybe are not graphic designer that are still that somebody with a graphic design background could really add value in and have a fulfilling career in. So that's also something we've been talking about, like to the young people who are just embarking on their careers and choosing what to study.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. And I actually have some of those same slides and presentations I give to students as well. And it's worth noting that not to sound negative or disparaging to anybody that got into this field, I'd say even pre-pandemic, there's a lot of people that may have got into the field for the wrong reasons. It looked like a lucrative career. It looked like, I can just be creative. And some of them really didn't understand what design is. We talk about this also in the book that, there's a subtle line as well as a Venn diagram between art and design. And, you still are creative in it as a designer, but it's so different depending on the different type of, specific area that you go into. And it's not necessarily better or worse, but it's just different. And also the fact that especially in technology, and it's I'm obviously that's the place that I've spent most of my career. There was just over hiring, and not just of designers but of engineers and product people and marketing people. So we're really, those stats are really just showing a little bit of a leveling out that's happening, or a course correction. It doesn't make it fun for anybody that's job hunting, but that's sort of the reality. That's why I say, like, if you are passionate about it, to use a pretty cheesy word, but to kind of stick with it, because designers are going to continue to be needed.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Oh, go ahead, Julia.
yeah. And the other thing that we also discussed with them, because they were some of them were uncertain of like what choices they might have for minor and major. And I think something that also came up in the conversation that is very much in line with what you said is the importance of them also knowing more about business and marketing skills, because if they end up becoming a manager at some point, this is so needed and not at that time is not really covered in a design traditional program.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I won't go on too long about that, but I certainly talk about that all the time, especially when it comes to designers leveling up. On one hand, we do have to acknowledge, like, design is very expansive. Expectations are very expansive. The skills required, and there's so much confusion because of the fact there's so many different types of job titles. Like, what can you actually do? But, once you start to kind of get a handle on what you're good at, what you like to do, that's when you need to kind of branch out and understand some of these other areas of responsibility and participate because you need to participate in all those as you move up the ranks quite a bit. And it is a surprise for some people for sure.
Yeah, I think that's the perfect segue to this follow-up question about what you've called day-to-day or soft skills that aren't necessarily taught in design schools. Although curricula are changing, but I went to school a long time ago. Um, there's this point, even on the sort of technical side of design, right, that tools change all the time. I don't even remember how many versions of the Adobe products that I've, used over the decades, right? But they're constantly now pushing updates and things like that. So there's always that stuff to learn. There's the AI stuff that we can talk about later. But then there's also these like human skills or soft skills. We've alluded to it earlier in this conversation with dealing with, say, like office politics or managing clients and managing up. All of these things I think fall under this big umbrella. And you deal with that in your book as well. So can you speak to that?
Yeah, yeah. One sentence on tools is I tell designers all the time, as I'm sure many of you do and some of your guests, like don't define yourself by the tools you use. I have a slide where there's like literally 100 different software titles. I'm like, yeah, I was proficient or consider my expert at all of these. Like
Yeah.
not even 1/10 of them still exist today. That's not the point. So yeah, for sure. But yeah, the soft skills, it's not so much that they're not encountered in school. Like design programs do, of course, they include collaboration, group projects, and communication and presentation, but there is more context really needed about doing it on the job. And this maybe we'll talk about it later, but this gets into the whole, you know, I'm just going to say this word. It implies a little bit more of a negative connotation than I mean it to, but this fetishization with design process, like we have to follow the process and when we get too rigid in all of these things, that's when, we grow a lot slower and people don't want to work with us because we don't exhibit as much flexibility and ability to kind of navigate in the moment. So yeah, communicating and doing things on the job are a lot more fluid and you have to like right size, how you interact with people and how do you communicate with people. And, like for example, when you're presenting work that you do, the stage that you're at, if you're early stage kind of scrappy design and you're meeting with your design partners, you can be very loose and very open. But when you're presenting to stakeholders, you want to get to the point. You want to get to like, the farther along work, not get too bogged down in the backstory of how you got there. So there's quite an art to that and it takes practice. One other thing that I will say about, in sort of the soft skills area, that's really not talked about enough, especially at the student level, is that basic time management is so important.
Yeah,
When you're a working
that's true.
designer, right? I mean, when you're a
Yeah.
working designer, you're on the hook to deliver things on a schedule, and also you're also trying to or expected to constantly level up. So, effectively managing your time, it varies for everyone. So I tell people, just be aware of like what takes you longer to do and what things are come easier to you so that you can actually more actively schedule your time effectively.
Yeah, and also to the fact that many designers at some point in their careers become a freelancer, and so they
Hmm.
also have to manage and plan and manage their time. And I remember last year in the AIGA conference, we had one session that was specifically on measuring the impact of design work. And one of the topics that the speaker brought was a lot on time management.
Nice.
And it was like a very, yeah, popular session. So it seems like designers wanted to learn more on how to improve in that sense.
Yeah, freelancing, that's an absolute great example because every hour extra you spend is your hourly
Yeah,
rate just
exactly.
dropped it or got cut in half in some cases. So yeah, time management is super critical.
Yeah. So Kevin, you have throughout your career reviewed many designers' CVs, portfolios, and also interviewed many designers for your previous roles, but also for your book. Can you share anything specific that has stuck out for you? Like what makes a designer stand out in the crowd?
Yeah, it's definitely harder to stand out today. So, I'd say imposter syndrome, for example, was already a hot topic among designers forever. But, I'd say it's like 10 times worse today because of the sheer amount of competition, for jobs. It's sort of raised that feeling. And I wish I could say that like being an excellent designer is a qualification enough to get hired, but really it's become more and more important to stand out with a personal brand. And I'm not just talking about like a visual style or flair or sharing that you like to go hiking, but just like design, we have to get to the why behind those aspects of yourself. And your personal brand has to really highlight what's unique about you. So I tell people like you are the thing that's unique. Like your great work will be compared with somebody else's great work. And then how do you differentiate, or how do you become memorable? And you know when you have your individual beliefs or your personal experience, and it's clear that they influence how you carry yourself, how you communicate, and even in your work decisions, like those are going to make you memorable when you interview with companies, and they may actually be the differentiating reason why somebody will say like, hey, I want to have that person on my team. So you have to really think more about that personal brand beyond the kind of surface for sure.
Yeah,
So
makes sense.
yeah, on that point, one way to stand out is maybe to have a point of view that maybe goes against the grain or common sense best practice. I'm going to stir up some controversy here with this next question. But what are some widely accepted, like common sense or best practice advice that is given to job seekers, to designers in their careers that you believe is actually flawed or maybe just outdated, something that doesn't really make sense anymore? Yeah. What is some conventional wisdom that you would like to argue against?
Sure. I think I dropped a little bit of a hint earlier mentioning design process, and I'll kind of bundle with that design thinking. Now, don't get me wrong. I believe in everything that design thinking represents, like human centeredness and deep research and iterative prototyping and all of that. And of course, I've adopted. My teams have used processes like the double diamond. But I have a joke in that presentation that I mentioned that I give students, and it's basically that. The first rule of design process is you do not talk about design process. For
It's
anybody,
just like Fight Club.
there you go. That's a
Yeah.
Fight Club reference, everybody. But I started sharing that advice mostly in regards to like day-to-day work. When I saw two things happening in the industry. The first is that, air quotes here, everyone became a designer. Of
Yeah.
course they did, because we invited partners to collaborate in design sprints and research and prototypes even before Figma. And they saw that the fun parts of the design process were easy, and so everyone became confident in their design opinions without participating in that, and what's essentially the deep design work. And the second was that, we as designers, we projected that what we do is so important that others need to learn about it. We need to teach them. Now, there's always going to be a certain level of evangelism that we're responsible for, but as we were already talking about earlier, like designers don't quite reciprocate by learning more about business and engineering complexity. So, again, I remind designers all the time that processes and frameworks are meant to be references. They're not meant to be followed as a rule book. They need to be modified and adapted for specific situations, different projects, opportunities, and constraints. So not to be so, dead set and siloed with, following some rigid process.
I think that's a really great point, especially in terms of like, because there was a shortage of designers a few years ago and these, different boot camps and other alternatives to traditional design school popped up. And sometimes
Hmm.
they would teach like very specific methods. And I mean, this happens in traditional design schools as well. So I'm not
Sure.
singling out boot camps or anything like that. But there was definitely, when you have an accelerated track to learn design, it does serve as a kind of training wheels version
For
of the
sure.
design process. But I don't know, certainly in every agency context I've worked in over the years, like nobody really had like a rigid process. And it's like now is on to the next stage, right? Like sometimes we would have like a set process that was really meant for like project management and client management. But in terms of the
Right.
day-to-day creative, like, anything can, anything could happen, right?
For sure. Yeah, like you said, I mean, they're there to be referenced. Like I'm sure I have the design sprint handbook behind me, and I definitely have used some of that exact 5-day design sprint format. I think I've used it one time, but every other time it was like adapting for the specific project or resources or goal or scope of a project. And yeah, my wife, obviously, she teaches design, Janine, and she talks about the design process. And I think one thing that's good for earlier career designers or even students that she describes it as, it's like, hey, it's there as a reference to fall back on when you do sort of lose your way or get kind of stuck. It's not meant to be like the step by step way you do design.
So the Design Career Handbook, it's a big book, but it's also very readable, conversational in terms of advice. But I always like to ask this of creative people about their large projects. Is there anything that ended up on the cutting room floor that just didn't work out, or maybe you just ran out of time and you wish you could have included, or maybe it's the start of a future project? Yeah, what's not in the book that you wish were in the book or that you might want to explore?
For sure, for sure. Yeah, first of all, thanks for, commenting that it's very readable. There's definitely a lot of topics in there, and I think we say right in the intro, there's a lot of topics in here, but we get right to the point. That's why we call it a handbook. And we definitely aim for it to be like evergreen, meaning, that hopefully it won't be outdated very quickly. But the first thing I'll say is, like, despite writing it during the hype and the crazy pace of AI development, we only mentioned it briefly, but it really was, not out of disinterest but more so to double down on our belief that the advice that are most for areas that are in our control will
Mhm.
remain important and valid. So that's how we thought about that. The second thing that didn't make it in was what I call like spicier stories that I wanted to share, but they just didn't
Yeah.
feel right for the format. But I've got the writing bug, so they're definitely part of what I'm working on now.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that preview and
Little
teaser. I
little
hope,
hints, right?
yeah,
Awesome.
hint,
Yeah.
hint. Yeah. We'll have to have you back when your next book
Yes.
drops. Um, cool. So I wanted to transition now to a topic that a lot of people are talking about, sometimes out of frustration, fear, sometimes eye rolling because people are just not into it, and that is AI. So you've before we get to AI, actually, you've talked about blurring these boundaries of product and design, and nudging designers to consider other roles, right? Whether it's product management or other things like that. So there are these other critical skills that we've been talking about that are transferable skills for designers. So before we get into like the specific stuff of AI, which even by the time this episode drops, something might have happened, right? Because it's moving so fast. Like, what are some of these like evergreen skills that you see that designers should really be cultivating regardless of the tools? And then we'll get to the AI questions.
Yeah, I won't go too deep, but we touched upon it a little bit, but it's what we talked about earlier, like especially understanding a bit more about business and product management and strategy. And from a very high level, that really just means like understanding the business model. I mean, are you working in an environment that's like a B2B or B2C or marketplace, or even if it's a nonprofit, there's still money being made and spent. So you have to understand that. You have to understand how value is captured. Is it monetary? Is it data? Is it advertising? You have to be attuned to goals and metrics. You have to know all those 3-letter, 4-letter acronyms. OKRs, KPIs, ROI,
Yeah.
DAU. Like all of the acronyms. Um, and and most importantly, though, as I said, you have to get invested in the roadmap. You have to understand and participate in strategy, prioritization, planning, timelines, and all of that. It's also very helpful to work closely with the more hardcore builders, like the coders, the engineers, because there's a lot of respect that comes when that something's very difficult to build, the complexity. But it also empowers you in the other way when you hear back, oh, that's going to take 10 weeks. Like, no, this is going to take you like 2 weeks. Come on. So it always just makes you a better partner when you understand the responsibilities of your partners. And, I think you said, Julia, earlier about, again, it's such a cliche thing to say, but you have to know how to connect your work, your design to the business or to the outcomes. And the only way you do that is by understanding how it fits into all that sets of responsibilities.
Yeah, that's very true.
Let's dive into the AI questions now that are on everybody's mind. So you have expressed strong views on AI before, emphasizing the need to be responsible responsible in integrating it into our workflows and not just like using it as a shortcut for critical thinking or decision making. So, what kind of advice do you have for designers to responsibly integrate AI into our processes?
Yeah, it is crazy, right? I mean, we can't get away from this topic. It's ever present. So many memes, good ones, bad
Yeah.
ones, frustrating ones,
Yeah.
for sure. I mean, the first thing I'll say is that when it comes to responsible and ethical AI usage, everyone needs to identify the criteria for their own red lines. A few that come to mind are it may be the amount of AI you use. Like, I think everyone needs to Google AI environmental impact, because for one reference that I just read recently is like there's a study that has estimated AI will account for half the total data center power usage by end of this year. That's crazy. The
Wow.
anecdotes of like 3 Mile Island being fired up to power AI for a specific customer. Another one is like if you decide not to use AI tools that were trained on copyrighted material without permission, and some of those are very, very known. Of course, you have to own the decisions in any process that uses AI. That brings up another topic that comes up a lot, which is this whole idea, and a lot of articles came out in the last handful of months, social media, about taste being essential in the age of AI. But the last thing I'll say is that I'm a technologist at heart, so I'm torn. I mean, I'm also playing with the tools, but I feel like a curmudgeon when I cite studies about the concerns, whether they be the ones that we just talked about. But just the other day, there was an MIT brain scan study on ChatGPT users
Mm.
that aligns with previous academic studies on cognitive decline. So, as designers and design thinkers, it is very alarming to me, that we have to find this balance. So I do, all that being said, designers must experiment with the tools to understand their capabilities, to figure out what amount and where to fit them in our processes, and most importantly, to actively participate in deciding how they are used. Because if we don't participate, they are being used by other people. So we have to really be there as well.
Yeah. There's some great points. I mean, how are there some examples that you can share of how you incorporate AI into your workflows?
I am on the lighter side, like you. I think you mentioned earlier, like I've been playing with some of the tools. I definitely played with some of the image generation tools early on. I'm a little bit of a humble brag here. I installed Stable Diffusion on my local machine, command line, and all that. But it was more out of not wanting to pay a server somewhere to generate images to test them out. And I've definitely, experimented with ChatGPT and Notebook LM, and I've been paying very close attention, but admittedly, I haven't done any vibe coding directly myself yet. And again, I'm very torn. We came up with all kinds of experimental tools, and so I can't say you shouldn't do that or it's wrong. But on the other hand, there are all these other concerns that are just different today. So yeah, so I'm very, very torn, and more on the cautiously optimistic and poking around a
Yeah.
great number of tools.
Totally. Yeah, for me, it's like the generative image stuff has, it's like it was a novelty, and for a few hours I like played
Right.
with it. It's like, oh, look at what can I make, right? But it's still very much like there's a certain aesthetic, and you can tell for most of these things, although that's changing quickly. And then I think it's more the large language models that I use, like preparing for this podcast, like feeding it previous interviews that you had done, and things like that, to maybe just like fill in some spots where that I'm not able to like fully process and synthesize information myself. But yeah, I'm still figuring it out as well.
Yeah, I agree. Some of those areas I think are very promising, although again, they always have a flip side. So, for example, even something as innocuous as like meeting notes and action items, I think that's pretty cool. They can read transcripts and summarize things. But once again, I think we have to remain the humans in the process. I know in a similar way, an area that it's being experimented a lot, and I've talked to user researchers on how they're using it to synthesize interviews, for example, is they're excited about it because it definitely is speeding up some things, but they're also like, but we have to also double check everything and make sure we agree with some of the assumptions or some of the ways that the synthesis has surfaced the most important takeaways, for example. And I've definitely talked to user researchers that are like, please don't automate our process.
Yeah.
But it's definitely being experimented with for sure.
Yeah, and those hallucinations are real. I've talked about this before on a previous
Totally.
episode of the show, but basically somebody had like asked ChatGPT about some UX topic, and and ChatGPT like suggested her a book that I supposedly wrote, but I did not
Wow.
write. But it was like, I'm real, the publisher was real, but the book was fake. And so this person actually emailed the publisher and me. Like she found us asking like, oh, when is the release date of this book? And both of us were like, this is not a real book. But yeah, so stuff like that happens too. So you definitely have to check your real sources.
I'll give you a super quick. I'll kind of steal an anecdote, or actually share an anecdote that Janine had recently. So she has an assignment in her class for the students to identify. So it's a very designer thing to talk about here. To identify Helvetica out in the wild, like find an example of Helvetica. And somebody had provided this sample, and Janine was like pretty certain it wasn't Helvetica, and she uploaded it to ChatGPT and said, "Hey, what font is this?" And ChatGPT was insistent that it was Helvetica. And Janine started talking with ChatGPT, saying like, "Oh, but this counter looks different, and this descender is not quite right." And then it was like, "Oh, you're right. You're very observant. You're right. That is not Helvetica." And it was kind of like, if she would have just accepted the first answer, it was wrong, and it was very confident. So yeah, hallucinations are real, even in such a small example, inconsequential example.
Um, it's funny that you're saying this because a couple weeks back, I went to an event and we had neuroscientists and behavioral scientists speaking also about AI. And one of the things that I think it was a speaker from Google, one of the things that she said was that the rationale of these systems are built to please us as a user. So the more critical we are when we're requesting something, and even re-requesting, like you mentioned that your partner did, is when you actually get more to a productive engagement, let's say. So that made me think of how we still need to have a lot of critical thinking when we're engaging with these models, because again, these things can happen, right? That the first answer is very untrue or
Right. Yeah, it's very easy to get overconfident as well. And I think that's the biggest thing that makes me the most nervous, is the fact that, we hear this all the time, that AI is going to eliminate the repetitive work. AI is going to allow us all to do higher level thinking or higher level work. And, frankly, I laugh at that. I'm like, today, nobody's working less hours than they did 10 years ago, 15 years ago. We're probably all working more hours. And, that's just the time element of it. But more importantly, this is why I get so nervous, and by extension, Janine, because she's interacting with students every year, is that work is really necessary to build up design
Mhm.
knowledge and design sense and the ability to make these decisions. And so if that work's being automated, how are people supposed to get started in this field? And how are they supposed to build up their own sensibilities about good design and successful design if they don't have that opportunity to get in what I call like those reps?
Yeah.
Because it takes, like I said, dozens to hundreds of projects before you're comfortable, having the ability to make decisions with less information, and, trusting in your gut, as opposed to just believing everything that's generated is going to be the best solution or the most ideal solution.
Yeah. That
Yeah.
reminds me of the most recent episode of John Oliver's show last week tonight, where he was talking about AI slop, and it featured a clip from like an angry Pinterest user who was complaining about all of the AI generated images on Pinterest. But I think it goes back to that too. It's like, okay, if our feeds are increasingly AI generated images, like even the things that we're like inspired by in our mood boards are like kind of, sausage made out of sausage kind of stuff rather than the primary things, right? So I think that's another, yeah, just reminder to have to go out, whether it's to books, to museums, to other places that are really like the source of things rather than the kind of regurgitated, reimagined stuff, right?
Right, right. Absolutely. I mean, yes, again, I'm sure it sounds very similar. Like we have to encourage career designers to get out there, to pick up books, to go look at what magazines are still out there. Thankfully, record albums are coming back. So there's
Yeah.
art that we used to be inspired by before, but literally like museums and parks and signage, we have to experience these things out there because they're just so important for us to develop our opinions and our points of views, as you mentioned earlier. It reminds me of this little spin-off topic around AI that was and probably is going to remain popular for a while, which is, a lot of people saying like taste is really, it's required in this age of AI. And for anybody that's ever worked in entertainment like I did for a while, like, it used to be this term called tastemaker. And, the whole
Hmm.
idea of having taste is on one hand, it can be very opinionated and just people just have opinions and what they say is cool, people believe is cool. But I always compare taste, and I wrote a little bit about this on Substack that taste for designers is really what we call like design sense. And what does
Hmm.
that mean? Like in practicality, it means that, we've developed a sensibility based on understanding design foundations and what is good and what is bad design. I say good and bad, even though, the more proper words are successful and unsuccessful.
Right.
But you all,
Yeah.
and hopefully all the designers out here know that's a stand-in for good and bad. And this is also a very designerly thing to say, but recognizing when like some rule is broken, whether it's intentional or not intentional, right? We always say that's a good mark of a designer is they know when to break the rules, or they intentionally will break the rules. But so designers have these frameworks and these skills to recognize quality or to judge quality and success, and that's what develops a good eye for detail. And and the whole human-centered design kind of perspective means that we really always keep the end users in mind, the audience in mind. And so we don't just blindly accept, like I said, everything that's generated as the best solution or ideal one. But as designers, we know to keep digging deeper and like why this is a good decision or a better decision, because they're founded in some things that are deeper rooted in us.
Yeah.
And
Thank you.
um, speaking of that, do you have any suggestion on how designers can continue um, cultivating their design sense or taste especially now in the era of AI?
Yeah, yeah, I think we've talked about it like 3 times, right? It's like designers have to get away from screens. It's
Yeah.
literally, whether it's a small screen or even the computer screen, like there's so much influence out there and things that we can learn from the past. It's so funny when people see like a really cool designer puts out this work, and if you've studied design, like 9 times out of 10 they were influenced by some great artist in the past or some artistic movement, like, deconstructivism or Art Deco or whatever it may be. And, now all of a sudden they're a rock star designer. Well, they just did that little bit of homework. They studied a few designers that came before, like a Neville Brody or, David Carson. It's like, oh, look at this cool new style by this artist. And it's like, hey, all the best artists and designers steal from the past, so it's not necessarily a bad thing. But it's a weird thing to even say that out loud because it's like, I can hear the lashback already. Well, how's that different than AI? And it's like, well, it's different because the point is you're taking in these influences, and the point is not to copy, but to incorporate them, to mash things together, to use them to help develop your own style, which is ultimately what usually happens by all those breakout design stars. It's not because they just copied one thing. I'll poke a finger right now at like Johnny Ive, like, especially given the OpenAI announcement recently. Like, not only has he always been forthright that most of his Apple work, his design work at Apple was inspired by Braun and
Yeah.
by, Dieter Rams. So it's like, here's an example. Like, go just do that. Go study, design that's come before. Go study art that's come before, movements, and get away from the screens that are just, you know, flooded with AI slop, as it is being called, right?
Totally. So, Kevin, thank you so much for joining us in this conversation today. Kevin Flores, you've been listening to him here, watching him here, is the co author of the Design Career Handbook. You can get it online on his website. We'll post links to everything. But just as a final call to action for our listeners and our viewers, where can folks find you and connect online? We'll post it in the show notes, obviously, but folks love to hear it from you directly.
For sure. I'm very active on LinkedIn, so I always tell people, please connect with me. Let me know how you found me, but that's great. I love to communicate with people there. And of course, check out the book's website. There's a cool resource page with tons of links that are pretty useful. I think that's Design Career Handbook or designcareerbook.com. And I'll just one closing though is I'll say or reiterate what we said earlier. Like the world of work right now, including design, is like we're in the middle of such massive disruption, but don't let that dissuade you if you really are interested in design and expressing and employing your creativity to develop cool stuff out there. So just please stick with it and dig in.
Thanks again, Kevin. Thank you all for watching or listening, and we'll see you next time. Bye, everyone.
Thanks. Thank you.